So our next session is Implementing PRIMOVE in a Consortial Environment, Finding the Balance. And our three speakers are Melissa Becker, the Associate Director of Research, Teaching, and Learning at American University Library in Washington, D.C. She's the administrator for the AU Library's reference service platforms, including LibGuides, LibAnswers, and Library Help Chat, and also conducts usability testing and other user studies. She serves with Rob and Shane on the AU Library's PRIMO administration team. Dean Hickey is the Interlibrary Services Coordinator, managing resource sharing operations at the American University Library. In this role, Shane oversees the fulfillment of faculty, student, and staff requests via Consortial Loan Service, Interlibrary Loan, and document delivery. When not in the library, Shane can be found in his garden. And Rob Kelshin has been with the University Library since 1999. As the Director of Access Services, the Access Services Division, he leads the Circulation Services, Course Reserves, Technology Services, Interlibrary Services, and Media Services departments within the University Library, as well as the University Library Services Management and Research and Discovery platforms. Yeah, I was like, sorry, this is all. You've done a lot. Robin served in various leadership capacities within both the Washington Research Libraries Consortia and the University Library, which includes handling multiple public and technical services units within the library at various times. Rob has presented on a range of topics, including revisioning library service relationships and change management processes within the field of library management. He's an alumnus of the AU's 21st Century Leadership Institute and has been a recipient of the American University Staff Innovation Award. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Let me see. Share. Here we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for letting us join you today and talk about our experience with implementing PRIMOVE and ALMA. Our email addresses are on the first slide, and please feel free to contact any of us offline if you or after the conference if you like, and we'll be happy to share any information we can about our process, how we handled our migration, how we're handling it afterward, all the things that we know, and probably more so the things that we still don't really know. So with that, I'll get started. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background for WRLC, our migration process, things that were difficult for us or challenges in terms of the migration, things we wish we would have known, and maybe a few things we wish we would have done differently. And Shane and Melissa are going to talk about two of the aspects of the migration that we were moving to ALMA and PRIMO that we were really interested in. One would be the automated fulfillment network, which Shane's going to talk in more detail about. And Melissa's going to talk about sort of the process of helping public services staff navigate the change to PRIMO. We were previously a summon library. And so Melissa's going to talk a little bit about that and helping our library faculty, staff, and our students with that change. Oh, where's my next slide? Oh, there we go. Okay, so WRLC is a group of 9 university libraries in the Washington, D.C. metro area. It was established in the late 80s, I believe, and the cornerstone services for Interlibrary were based on resource sharing and their offsite storage management system. We have 3 offsite storage facilities where all of the libraries will send various print materials, microforms, that sort of thing. So since we're all within driving distance of one another, we have a courier service that delivers materials in 2 loops at each day to every library. So that was the foundation of what the consortium was built around. Our previous library environment had had 7 libraries sharing a Voyager database. So the 7 of us had all of our patron and bibliographic information in a single database with separate instances that we all ran on our own. But within that, we could see patron activity at any library. So a library user could check out books from any library. They could check with staff at any library, looking at their library account to tell them what materials they had out. And they could look at and ask, inquire about their library fines as well, and they could pay their library fines at any library too. So we did a lot of sharing of patron data, obviously, and with bibliographic data before the migration. So we were very interested in maintaining that as we moved to ALMA. There was one library, George Mason, that had their own Voyager database, and Georgetown was on their own instance of Sierra. So within that environment, we also had developed our own homegrown resource sharing system, which would allow users to make unmediated requests for materials that could be delivered through the courier system, as I had mentioned earlier. For our migration team, we had representatives from each library, and this process started in 2014 when we put out an RFP from different vendors for their library management platforms. So what it really came down to is that we were looking at either World Share Management Services or ALMA PRIMO, and we ended up going with ALMA. And we had a very long implementation schedule. We went, it was 18 months, and we were the first library to go live with PRIMOVE as a consortium. We had the opportunity to use the classic PRIMO, but we eventually would have had to migrate to V anyway. And so since the only library that had any experience with PRIMO previously was George Mason, we just decided to go live with PRIMOVE and take our lumps as we encountered them. Shane's nodding vigorously. One of the things that we really wanted out of the migration was that we wanted all of our libraries to be on the same platform, which we did achieve. And within that as well, our later in the migration process, our law and medical libraries also joined in, and so now the majority of them are also on ALMA as well. So some of the technical and mental hurdles that we had around the implementation. So on the technical side, the automated fulfillment network was not quite as developed as we had hoped it would be. It was still very early on in the process of developing that. I think maybe the Connecticut system was the first system to go live with it, but it did not actually replicate the functionality that we had previously had in our previous system entirely. And so that was a little disappointing, but Ex Libris has made a lot of adjustments to that system very quickly, and now it replicates more accurately what we had before. Though not exactly, and again, Shane will get into that. We had a really significant issue around the loading of our electronic resources. It had to be done multiple times, which delayed our implementation and go live dates by about maybe a week or a week and a half. And we're still kind of working through the management of the materials at our shared collections facility. The facility has its own institution zone, and so we're still sort of wrestling with how to circulate materials that are located in the shared collections facility but owned by the various libraries, and we're trying to figure out how best to make that work. Some of the kind of mental challenges that we had were kind of we had at least one library that had experience with using the PRIMO back office, and PRIMOVE doesn't have a back office. It's configured in ALMA, and so we had to kind of figure out how that exactly would work for us. Unlike Voyager, the ALMA and PRIMO are in a constant state of development. So what's happening in your implementation is actually probably pretty different than what happened in ours. And ours was very different than probably what happened with some of the other libraries that we talked to, like again, the Connecticut system and also with Cal State. So since the system's updated monthly, there are changes and enhancements that are put in place every month. So something that didn't work this month may very well be corrected for next month or in the coming months. So it's good to talk to libraries about their experiences, but it's also you also run the risk of getting discouraged by what they experienced, in which are things that you may not experience at all in your implementation. So the other challenge was that, and I'm sure this actually I think probably is true of every implementation, that Ex Libris has recommendations for your workflows based on how ALMA works, and sometimes those can be radically different from what are in place in your library. And so you kind of have to go through the exercise of making choices about what changes you want to make to your workflows and which ones you don't want to make, and accepting that ALMA won't work optimally if you sort of don't follow their instructions, and if you're willing to kind of to go along with the frustration in order to keep what you have in place, because it might make the most sense for you or your library. Things that I wish we would have done a little bit differently in hindsight, of course, is that I wish we're a very decentralized consortium, and we do a lot of things independently, even though we were sharing a lot of data in our previous environment. And I kind of wish now we would have spent a little more time talking about what we wanted to do centrally. So what types of activities or resources we wanted to manage centrally, because as you know, within the network zone structure in PRIMO, you're working, or within ALMA, you're working with a single bibliographic record. And so management of that was not, I think in the process of it, we couldn't fully visualize how ALMA worked. And so it was hard to have those discussions, particularly when you have a culture of the consortium being so decentralized. So I think, again, in hindsight, which is very easy to do, it would have been nice to talk more about the things that we wanted to do together. And now it feels a little bit like we're working a little bit backwards in some of our existing committees now dealing with ALMA and PRIMO are starting to have more conversation about, like, well, what are we really trying to get out of the system and what do we want it to do? So that's my piece of it. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm sure there'll be time after the presentation as well. And I'm going to pass it over to Shane, who's going to talk more about the automated fulfillment network.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm going to discuss the automated fulfillment network, which is basically the replacement for our pre-existing consortium loan service and how that manifested itself in PRIMOVE. So one of the biggest hurdles we had was deciding which configurations should be done in each institution zone and which configurations need to be done at the network zone level and then pushed down to all of the institution zones. And we have 15 institution zones within our network. So at AU and for each of the other institution zones, some of the configurations we had to work with was establishing linked records. As Rob was saying, we went from having a shared Voyager database, George Mason Voyager, and Georgetown Sierra. So our patrons had 3 library accounts. And we at AU were able to interact with all 3 of those library accounts and renew materials, take fines, etc. But now our patrons are moving to an environment with basically 1 home account and up to 14 linked accounts. So our patrons were actually having far more library accounts than they had in the past. But on the staff side, we were circulating all the items out of one system. So there were pros and cons to that. We had to redefine our relationship with storage, and Rob kind of touched on that. Storage is now its own institution zone. And with that, our storage facility now has patrons emailing them. They're accruing fines out of the storage facility, and we have far less control over our own materials out there. So our patrons may have a book in hand that's stamped American University with an AU barcode, but here at AU, we have no ability to renew it, for example, because it lives in a different institution zone. So trying to find the balance between us and storage, us and the 14 other IZs, and where these rules belonged required quite a bit of discussion. We did come up with some shared configurations that were distributed from the network zone. Number 1 is the WRLC fulfillment unit. This is basically the backbone of the AFN, and this states what is allowed to be loaned and requested. But I should note that a lot of the rules that dictate what can't be loaned or what cannot be requested still live within each institution zone. So there's a lot of working together to make sure all of the rules across the institution zones and network zones work well together. At the same time, we were bringing in a number of professional libraries that each decided to have different relationships with the AFN and different relationships with the shared storage facilities. So we were balancing that as well. And ultimately, we were trying to recreate a resource sharing system that had been in existence for decades, and we needed to recreate this in 18 months and get it up and running. So here's an example of where maybe if you don't have all your configurations aligned, you could experience issues. Your patrons could be quite confused. For us, we knew that we wanted all loans to be anonymized on a similar schedule, and we did not want to display historical loans to our patrons. But this required us to have the exact same settings in each of the 15 IZs, and communicating that for every little choice you have to make can be challenging at times. This was an example we discovered months after go live where patrons were actually seeing their historical loans because we did not have those settings the same across all 15 of our institution zones. There were some implications of using the AFN and PRIMOVE for both staff and patrons. Fine collection has been an issue for us. There is no way for us to collect fines at any of our consortial partners in their institution zones. This is very different than what we had in the past, where we could collect fines that our patrons accrued at every single library within our consortium. As I'm saying some of these things, you might be like, well, I expect it to work the way that Shane's describing it. But unfortunately, we had not truly understood the implications of some of these changes and how they would impact our patrons. On that note, consortial renewals are a challenge for patrons at times. In the past, they could call us and we could renew their books regardless of which library they came from. Now when they call us, we can only renew the books they have checked out from our institution zone. So patrons have a lot more responsibility in initiating their own renewals and maintaining their account than they did in the past. And on that, we also had some issues with our linked records. Those are basically your patrons' accounts at each institution zone. The biggest hurdle we've had is those linked accounts quite often go expired when we don't want them to. The account expiration date refreshes when a patron checks out an item at a partner or requests an item from a partner. But if they renew an item at a partner, which is what they do most often in many cases, it does not refresh that expiration date. So their accounts are expiring when they still have items. We've had some issues with the consortium loan service request form, and I have that here, an image of that. The basic message right now as we're working with Ex Libris to navigate these issues is don't touch those fields. Basically, if you were to enter any information into any of the request fields, author, publisher, date, etc., you would sort of break the request form and none of our libraries would receive it to fill your request. So right now, the fix for that is to remove the fields and kind of limit what our patrons can do to interact with the request form. But at the same time, that also means patrons can't do article requests or book chapter requests because they can't give us their citation. So we have seen a large increase in ILL requests at the same time. And we've had to manage a lot of patron expectations, which I know Melissa's going to touch on as well. For us, a lot of that had to do with the new My Library account, which is one of the main ways patrons interact with their materials. On the left-hand side here, I have what the My Library account looked like at Go Live. And this is what it looks more like now on the right. And Ex Libris has worked with us through Salesforce tickets to improve the My Library account experience. One of the biggest hurdles we had was where patrons were not able to actually find their linked records. There was a hidden drop-down menu at the top. I have an arrow pointing to it. Patrons had to find that drop-down menu and then actually find each linked record from the drop-down menu and go one at a time. So now we have an environment, at least, where patrons can see all of their linked record options at once, which makes this a bit easier for them. To sum up, basically, we spent 18 months trying to implement what we had in the past. The next 6 months, we were learning technology, and now we're finally at a point where we're reassessing everything and actually understanding the system and seeing what we can do to make this better and basically reconsider everything. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Shane. I'm speaking from the service desk, public service side of the issue. And I think our main challenge here is that some of the problems that Rob and Shane have been discussing with you were not resolved when we had to go live. And, you know, when you have to go live, you have to go live, whether your data is cleaned up or whether, you know, patrons can make consortium loan requests or not. So from the public services side, it becomes a challenge of, you know, how to prepare service desk staff who are anxious about putting out a system that's not ready to deal with those challenges and to work with patrons. So here are some of the things that we did to try to help the transition. For one thing, when we were setting up the initial configuration, we did a series of short, quick user testing activities. And we had a nimble, small testing group that we worked with to help us make decisions about, you know, labeling, about, you know, how many scopes to use, things like that. And the group consisted of both student assistants that worked at the library, but we also incorporated the librarians that served the most at the research assistance desk. That way, they could become part of the process of making things better for patrons. We would send out things like, well, what do you think we should call this? Or we could do this, we could do it this way or this way. What makes more sense? And they could see the problem, and they could also, you know, tell us, you know, what they thought made the most sense for patrons, and we would incorporate many of those changes. Another thing we did was in training, we had to train on one of our test loads. So we already, you know, could talk about, that gave us a perfect opportunity to talk about some of the problems that may or may not be fixed after the service goes live, and give strategies to people for how to discuss these things with users and what to do. We developed a status page for known issues. I'm just going to flip over for a second to show what that looked like. It was a web page where we could put everything that we knew that was not working with the system, and provide a link to our services desk staff so they could go and see what was wrong, and they could direct patrons to it. There's also a link down here, you know, to report a problem. And this allowed them, you know, access to information for patrons, but also there were a number of times when, you know, things were supposed to have been fixed, and we put on the status page that they were fixed, but then, you know, a patron would have an issue, so, you know, they could be part of the process of reporting that and letting us know that it really wasn't fixed yet. Also, we set up troubleshooting support priority for issues regarding PRIMOVE, and that worked really well. And then later on, after we went live a little later, we were able to expand that so that access services staff, many of the access services staff could also support users with troubleshooting. And finally, direct communication with users. We have marketing communications that went out to faculty and staff directly. We talked about PRIMOVE at an important Teaching with Technology conference that happens every August that our faculty are involved with. We got a lot of direct communication out to users about what the system was, what the benefits of the system were, et cetera. So I think I may be about out of time. So I'm just going to skip my last slide here, and we're going to go right to questions. Or
I was going to say you have about another 5 minutes if you want before we need to take questions.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll just talk about. I was almost finished. I'll just talk about this last slide then. There are a couple of task forces that we were able to put together through the consortium that helped us implement PRIMOVE and respond to possible user issues. One was the PRIMO implementation task force. Each of these had a member from every school that got together. One of the things this task force did was standardize configuration and language among all of the instances of PRIMOVE. So we were able to decide on, certain things that would remain the same library to libraries to help users access the system and use it in the different consortium libraries. The task force also helped identify issues to report to Ex Libris to get fixed, and also developed a training plan, and the things that needed to go into the PRIMOVE training. Also, we had a PRIMO communication task force that came up with a bank of marketing pieces that were helpful for libraries to see what other people were doing, and also developed contingency communication plans, which is really helpful when our implementation was delayed. That's a good thing to keep in mind. What happens if you don't go live when you think you're going to go live, after you've told everybody when you're going to go live. So that was also really helpful. So that is all for me. So I guess we're ready for questions.
Yeah, definitely.
Sure. So there are a couple of questions so far in the chat. Cynthia wanted to know if you guys were using the terms ILL request and resource sharing interchangeably.
No, right? I mean,
I guess I use resource sharing as like a broad term for all of our resource sharing services. And when I say ILL, I mean stuff that we do through OCLC and ILLiad. And then our consortium loan service is basically a resource sharing service that's just with the 15 institution zones. Yeah. And that's done through PRIMO and outside of OCLC.
Sure. Abigail wanted to know, are consortial configuration settings able to be set across all institutions, or do they have to be set by each institution themselves?
It depends what you're trying to configure. So you can have settings done at the network zone level, and you can then push those settings down to each institution zone. The thing to keep in mind is with a lot of those settings, if after the network zone has pushed a setting down, if an institution zone then goes and changes that setting, the next time the network zone pushes an update, like that institution zone won't get it because they've changed it.
So you might have like a set of fields that are considered like a one category together, and they may have 10 values that can be changed. And to Shane's point, if you as an institution modify any one of those values, the next time a network a change is made to any of those values at the network level, it won't pick up any of the changes in your institution. So it's like if you change one, you're basically forfeiting the changes to any of the other fields or values in that group of configurations.
You'll see in your configurations, like for fulfillment units, you'll see who owns it, whether it's the institution or the network, and that will let you know basically who's governing that setting.
Yeah.
Vicky wanted to know, does your help desk use any sort of ticketing software to track the issues?
Yeah, our university, our Office of Information Technology adopted a new service called ServiceNow, which different departments in the university are using for various purposes, and we started using it for our ticketing of problems with PRIMO. So in our Summit environment, the ticket to submit issues was very difficult to find, and we didn't want to replicate that this time around. And so it's far more prominent to report an issue. It's basically from any record that you're on, you can link to that report a problem form. And that form goes into ServiceNow. And then again, in our Summit environment, it was just our e-resources staff, which is essentially 3 people that were troubleshooting problems that work 9 to 5. And so we decided to, what Melissa was speaking about earlier, we expanded that to include our circulation staff who are here from 8 a.m. until midnight. And so they now take part as well. And we, they work collaboratively with the resources staff to troubleshoot issues.
Okay. Carmen wanted to know, can you say a little bit more about your multiple test loads? How many were there, and was there one big issue? I think that we had there were two test loads, but we did have an issue with the e-resources load, but I don't think it was just limited to us. I think that there was a problem with the main offices in Israel, where they were anybody who was implementing at the time we were had an issue with their e-resources being loaded, and so it delayed our go live date by about a week and a half. At least it ended up that way. Does that answer the question? Sorry. I'm not sure if it answered her question or not, but if something pops up in the question and answer, I will let you know. So Moira wanted to know, was the demise of the traditional OPAC and replacement with PRIMO an issue with staff or users in your consortia?
I think it has been a challenge for some folks to get used to the difference between working in PRIMO rather than working in the OPAC. I think that we were talking about this between the 3 of us, I think the last time we were talking about a presentation. I mean, in the OPAC, you're sort of dealing with a static set of data. And if no one manipulates that data, anytime you do a search, you're going to get the same result. Whereas in PRIMO, you're linking to data that is changing. And so that can result in your in search results changing as well. And so that can be unsettling for staff who are helping users, and they're expecting a search that they perform to yield certain results, and then maybe it doesn't. It's something that's very different than what they previously found, or even slightly different, and that can be hard to get used to. But for undergraduates, I don't think we've seen a lot of complaints about it, and I think that actually the transition has gone more easily than we thought it might, and I think they actually maybe have adapted a little bit easier than some of our library staff have.
Yeah, I could speak to that too. I've talked to, when I talk to faculty about this, they actually appreciate a lot of things about the new system and say they like it because the catalog search is now incorporated into the system, and we had a separate link to the catalog search before. And they like the streamlining process of the interlibrary loan because they can request an interlibrary loan right from the system, whereas before they had to go and do a separate interlibrary loan request.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
So they do like that. From the reference librarians, one thing that we're really missing is the lack of Library of Congress subject headings. Yeah. That is the main thing that we are missing. And hopefully, I don't know what to do about that. Yeah. But you don't have the same access to those headings that you did before.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I see there are a couple of other questions here, but unfortunately we need to move on to keep to our schedule. So if anybody else has any questions for our presenters, their email addresses actually were on the first slide of the presentation.
Yeah, we can go back to that.
If you don't mind.
Not at all.
Before we move on.
There you go.
So the presenters' emails are up on the screen. Rob, Shane, and Melissa, thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you all too. Thanks for letting us participate.
Oh, sure, you're welcome. Thank you for presenting.